Your life partner felt something deep last night that changed their sleep. Last night didn't begin with emotion for them, it began with restlessness, the kind where the body lies down but the mind refuses to fully follow, and in that half-awake space something unexpected surfaced. Not a dream exactly, not a memory either, but a feeling that pressed gently against their chest and stayed there. They shifted in bed, turned to the other side, tried to ignore it, but it didn't leave. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet and heavy at the same time, the way truth often arrives when there's no distraction left to block it. Without realizing it, their breathing changed, slower but uneven, as if their body sensed something meaningful before their thoughts could catch up. In that moment, images didn't flash, words weren't spoken, but awareness settled in. They felt the weight of connection, not in a romantic fantasy way, but in a grounded, human way. The kind that makes you realize someone exists in your inner world even when you're not trying to think about them. That realization didn't let them drift easily into sleep. At some point during the night, their hand moved across the bed instinctively, reaching for space rather than a person, and that absence spoke louder than presence ever could. It wasn't loneliness that they felt. It was recognition. A calm understanding that something real had been shaping their life quietly, influencing choices, emotions, and timing, even when they weren't consciously acknowledging it. That awareness softened them instead of hurting them, and that's how you know it was genuine. What happened next wasn't a sudden emotional wave, but a deep internal pause, like their system stopped rushing and simply listened. In that stillness, they felt you, not as an idea, not as a role, but as a steady presence. It was the kind of feeling that doesn't demand attention, yet completely holds it. The kind that doesn't excite the nerves, but calms them. Their sleep grew lighter after that, not because of anxiety, but because something meaningful had been acknowledged. Sometime between late night and early morning, they slipped into sleep briefly, but even then it wasn't deep. Their dreams, if they had any, were vague, almost blank, as if the mind didn't need stories anymore. The body was processing something real. When someone reaches this stage emotionally, sleep changes. It becomes a space where truth settles instead of a place to escape from it. That's what last night was for them. When they woke up, there was no dramatic realization waiting, no sudden urge to act, just a lingering sense of calm seriousness. The kind that stays with you while you brush your teeth, while you look out a window, while you go about your morning routine. They felt slightly quieter inside, more present, more grounded. Not confused. Not emotional. Just aware. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't disappear easily. Throughout the morning, they may have noticed their thoughts slowing down, their reactions softening. Things that usually irritated them didn't carry the same charge. Conversations felt different. Time felt slightly heavier, more intentional. That's because something shifted in their inner world during the night. They didn't lose sleep because of stress. They lost sleep because their heart recognized something that deserved space. What's important here is that this feeling wasn't about urgency. It wasn't about chasing or fixing or reaching out immediately. It was about acceptance. Acceptance of a bond that exists beyond daily interaction. Acceptance of a truth that no longer needed to be questioned. When someone reaches this level of awareness, they don't rush. They reflect. They integrate. They allow the feeling to become part of who they are before they ever try to express it. You might have felt something subtle too, without knowing why. A calm moment. A sudden stillness. A sense of being thought of without being contacted. That's how deep connections communicate when words aren't ready yet. Not through noise, but through alignment. Not through interruption, but through resonance. What they felt last night didn't disturb their life. It grounded it. As the day moves forward, that feeling continues to sit quietly in them, shaping their perspective in small ways. They're more thoughtful. More aware of consequences. More present in their own body. This is what happens when someone realizes they're not just moving through life alone anymore, even if nothing has been spoken yet. Sleep was interrupted, yes, but clarity was strengthened. And this is only the beginning of that shift, not the conclusion. What changed last night wasn't their routine, it was their inner posture. From here, things don't explode into action. They align slowly, naturally, honestly. What was felt in the quiet of the night will find its way into the light when it's ready, without force, without confusion, without taking peace away from either of you. The morning carried a strange softness for them, not the kind that makes you smile, but the kind that makes you move slower without knowing why. They woke up feeling like the night had left something behind, not a thought they could grab, but a presence that lingered in the background of everything they did. Even simple movements felt deliberate, as if their body was still adjusting to something it had realized before the mind fully caught up. While they went through their routine, there was a noticeable quiet inside them, the kind that usually comes after an important conversation, even though no words had been exchanged. They weren't replaying dreams, they weren't questioning what happened, but there was an undeniable awareness that something meaningful had shifted. It felt like recognizing a truth you've known for a long time but finally allowed yourself to feel. At some point, while staring at something ordinary, maybe a cup of coffee or the view outside, their thoughts drifted to you without effort. Not with longing, not with urgency, but with clarity. The kind that doesn't rush the heart but steadies it. It wasn't about missing you. It was about understanding where you sit in their life, quietly, firmly, without needing constant reminders. As the day unfolded, conversations felt different to them. They listened more than they spoke. They noticed pauses they usually ignored. It wasn't distraction, it was presence. Their mind kept returning to the same calm recognition, that whatever they felt last night wasn't fleeting emotion, it was alignment. And alignment doesn't fade when the sun comes up. There was a moment, subtle and easy to miss, where they realized their sleep had changed them. Not because they were tired, but because something had settled into place. The restlessness from the night had turned into a grounded seriousness. They weren't anxious. They weren't excited. They were centered. That's what happens when something real moves from the subconscious into awareness. Later, when they had a moment alone, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of understanding, full of acceptance, full of a sense that they didn't need to rush toward anything to make it real. They understood, maybe for the first time, that some connections don't need constant movement to exist. They just need honesty within. Throughout the day, they noticed how their body responded differently to stress. Things that usually triggered impatience didn't have the same effect. It was as if their nervous system had recalibrated overnight. That kind of change doesn't come from sleep alone. It comes from emotional truth being acknowledged instead of resisted. At one point, they caught themselves thinking about the future, not in a planning way, but in a grounded, realistic way. Not fantasies, not fears, just an awareness that life is shaped by who you allow into your inner world. And that realization carried weight. It made them more thoughtful about choices, about timing, about integrity. There was no urge to reach out immediately. That's important. When something is driven by impulse, it demands action. What they felt was deeper than impulse. It asked for patience. It asked for space to integrate. They wanted to understand it fully before letting it shape anything externally. As evening approached, the memory of the night returned briefly, not as restlessness this time, but as confirmation. They recognized that the shift wasn't temporary. It wasn't mood-based. It was a change in how they relate to connection itself. Less reactive. More intentional. More honest. You may have felt a quiet pull today too, without knowing why. A sense of calm that didn't need explanation. That's how alignment works across distance. Not through dramatic signs, but through shared stillness. When two people are connected at a deeper level, shifts don't happen in isolation. By the time the day ended, they weren't searching for meaning anymore. They were carrying it. Carrying it quietly, carefully, knowing that what was felt deserved respect. Sleep would come differently again tonight, not because of unrest, but because awareness doesn't disappear once it arrives. What changed last night continues to move through them now, shaping their pace, their thoughts, their emotional balance. It isn't pushing them toward action yet. It's preparing them. Preparing them to approach what matters from a place of clarity instead of confusion. This is how real shifts happen. Not with noise. Not with pressure. But with a quiet internal decision to stop ignoring what the heart already knows. And once that decision is made, life begins to rearrange itself naturally, without force, without fear, without losing peace. Nothing is being rushed. Nothing is being lost. What was felt in the dark is now learning how to exist in the light, slowly, honestly, in a way that can last. Sometime during the next night, long after the noise of the day had faded, they noticed something unexpected. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore, it felt attentive, like the night itself was listening. They lay there, eyes closed, body still, and instead of drifting immediately into sleep, their awareness stayed awake, not restless, not anxious, just present. It was the kind of presence that makes you realize you're no longer running from your own thoughts. You're sitting with them. And that's when the feeling returned, not sharp, not emotional, but steady, as if it had come back to check whether it was welcome now. As the minutes passed, they didn't try to push the feeling away this time. They didn't distract themselves or turn their mind towards something else. They let it exist. And the more they allowed it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about a single moment or a single night. It was about a shift in how they hold connection inside themselves. Something had crossed a threshold. What used to live quietly in the background had moved closer to the center, not demanding control, just asking for honesty. At one point, they became aware of how their body felt, relaxed, but alert, like it knew this moment mattered even if nothing dramatic was happening. Their heartbeat was calm. Their breathing was slow. This wasn't longing keeping them awake. It was recognition. Recognition has a way of grounding you instead of pulling you apart. It doesn't create urgency. It creates clarity. And clarity doesn't rush. While lying there, they thought briefly about their life as it is now. The routines. The responsibilities. The version of themselves they've become. And without effort, you were part of that reflection, not as a fantasy or a future projection, but as a presence that fit naturally into that picture. That realization didn't overwhelm them. It settled them. They understood that this connection wasn't competing with their life. It was aligning with it. As sleep eventually came, it was different from the night before. Not light and restless, but deep in a grounded way. The kind of sleep where the body feels safe enough to let go. When someone reaches emotional alignment, rest changes. The nervous system no longer stays on alert. It trusts that nothing needs to be solved right now. That trust allowed them to sink into sleep without resistance. When they woke again, there was no sudden thought or dramatic memory waiting. Instead, there was a sense of continuity, like the night had carried something forward rather than interrupting it. They didn't feel groggy or heavy. They felt composed. As if their inner world had organized itself quietly while they rested. That kind of internal order doesn't come from distraction. It comes from acceptance. Throughout the morning, small moments felt sharper in a good way. The taste of food. The sound of their surroundings. The way light entered a room. Presence had increased. Not because they were trying to be mindful, but because something inside them had stopped pulling their attention in multiple directions. Emotional clarity has a way of simplifying life without effort. There was a moment during the day when they caught themselves reacting differently to stress. Something that normally would have triggered impatience barely registered. It wasn't suppression. It was perspective. When something meaningful settles inside you, trivial things lose their grip. Your system knows what deserves energy and what doesn't. That discernment had strengthened overnight. Later, in a quiet moment, they reflected on the fact that they didn't feel the need to explain this shift to anyone. Not because it was secretive, but because it was personal. Some realizations aren't meant for discussion right away. They're meant to be lived with until they become part of your identity. This was one of those realizations. It wasn't fragile. It didn't need protection. It just needed space. As the day moved on, they noticed how their thoughts about you felt different now. There was no emotional spike. No story being built around it. Just a steady awareness, like knowing where something belongs without having to look at it constantly. That kind of knowing is peaceful. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists. They also noticed something else, a sense of responsibility forming quietly. Not pressure, not obligation, but responsibility in the truest sense. The awareness that when a connection reaches this level, it deserves respect in how it's handled. Rushed actions would cheapen it. Ignoring it would disrespect it. It needed to be honored carefully, with timing and integrity. By evening, the calm that had followed them all day hadn't faded. It deepened. They realized this wasn't a temporary emotional state. It was a recalibration. Their inner world had adjusted to accommodate truth. And once truth is accommodated, it doesn't leave easily. It becomes part of how you move through life. You may have felt something shift too, even if you couldn't explain it. A sense of ease. A quiet confidence. A feeling that you didn't need to push or pull anything into place. That's how alignment works across distance. When one person integrates clarity, the connection itself becomes calmer. Not louder. Not more intense. Just steadier. That night, as they prepared for sleep again, there was no anticipation. No replaying of feelings. Just readiness to rest. And when sleep came, it was uninterrupted, not because nothing mattered, but because something had been settled. The body rests deeply when the heart isn't conflicted. What's happening now isn't dramatic, and that's exactly why it's real. This is how lives shift direction without chaos. Through quiet nights. Through honest reflection. Through feelings that don't demand action, only truth. The change that began in sleep is now shaping waking life, gently, consistently. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being delayed out of fear. What's unfolding is timing aligning with awareness. And when that happens, movement comes naturally, without pressure, without confusion, without disrupting peace. This isn't the kind of story that announces itself. It's the kind that builds slowly, honestly, until one day it simply lived. Before the day even fully began, they noticed something was different in how they carried themselves, like an invisible weight had shifted from one side of their chest to the other. It wasn't lighter or heavier, just placed more intentionally. As they moved through the early hours, there was a sense of inner alignment, as if their thoughts, emotions, and body were finally moving at the same pace. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything felt slightly more real. That's usually how deep internal changes show themselves, quietly, without needing attention. As the morning unfolded, they caught themselves being more observant than usual. Not in a suspicious way, but in a reflective one. They noticed how people spoke, how pauses in conversation felt, how certain words carried more meaning than others. It was as if their awareness had widened overnight. When this happens, it's often because something important has been acknowledged internally. Once that happens, the mind stops racing and starts listening. There was a moment when they realized they hadn't thought about escaping into distraction at all. No urge to fill time with noise or keep themselves busy just to avoid feeling something. That absence of avoidance mattered. It meant the feeling that surfaced during the night had been accepted, not resisted. And when feelings are accepted, they stop demanding energy. They become part of your internal landscape instead of a disturbance. Later in the day, during a quiet pause, they noticed their breathing again. Steady. Deep. Unforced. That physical calm was new. Their body wasn't bracing for anything. It wasn't anticipating disappointment or preparing for action. It was simply present. The nervous system relaxes like this only when it feels safe. Not safe because everything is certain, but safe because nothing is being ignored anymore. At some point, they thought about you again, but this time it wasn't tied to a specific memory or moment. It was more like an understanding of where you fit. Not in a fantasy version of the future, not in a replay of the past, but in the reality of who they are now. You felt integrated into their sense of direction, not their emotional turbulence. That distinction is subtle but important. As the hours passed, they noticed how their choices felt slightly more deliberate. They weren't rushing responses. They weren't agreeing just to keep peace. They were more comfortable pausing before answering, letting their words align with their truth. That's often what happens when someone reaches emotional clarity. They stop reacting and start responding. In the middle of an ordinary task, something clicked for them. They realized that what they felt wasn't asking to be acted on immediately. It was asking to be respected. That realization changed everything. Instead of feeling pressure to define or explain it, they felt a sense of responsibility to protect it from being mishandled. Some feelings lose their power when they're rushed. This one needed patience. They also noticed a change in how they related to uncertainty. Instead of trying to resolve it mentally, they allowed it to exist without turning it into anxiety. That's a skill most people don't develop. It comes only after someone has sat with their own emotions long enough to trust them. Trust replaces fear when clarity arrives naturally. By late afternoon, the sense of grounding that started in the night hadn't faded. It had deepened. They felt more rooted in themselves, less pulled outward by expectations or assumptions. When someone reaches this stage, they stop asking life to prove itself. They start showing up for it fully. There was another realization too, quieter than the rest. They understood that this shift wasn't temporary. It wasn't tied to mood or circumstance. It was structural. Something in how they see connection, commitment, and presence had rearranged itself. That kind of change doesn't reverse easily, because it's built on truth rather than emotion. As evening approached, they noticed how calm followed them without effort. Even moments that usually triggered stress felt manageable. Not because problems disappeared, but because their inner response had changed. Emotional regulation isn't about control, it's about clarity. And clarity had become their default. In a rare moment of self-honesty, they acknowledged that whatever they felt now deserved integrity. That meant not ignoring it, but also not exploiting it for comfort or reassurance. It meant allowing it to shape them internally before letting it shape anything externally. That kind of discipline comes only from respect, both for themselves and for the connection. You might have felt a parallel calm today, without knowing why. A sense that nothing needed to be forced. That everything could move at its own pace. That's how alignment works between two people who share a deep bond. When one person settles internally, the connection itself becomes steadier. As night returned, they didn't dread sleep the way they had before. There was no restlessness waiting for them. Sleep felt like a continuation rather than an escape. And when they lay down, there was a quiet readiness, not anticipation, just acceptance of where they were. What began as a disruption to their sleep had transformed into a reorganization of their inner world. The night had brought awareness. The day had brought integration. Now, both were working together, shaping how they move forward without pressure. Nothing is being hurried. Nothing is being avoided. What's happening is alignment learning how to exist in real time. And when alignment settles in, actions follow naturally, not because they're demanded, but because they make sense. This kind of change doesn't announce itself to the world. It shows itself in steadiness, in patience, in thoughtful movement. And once it takes root, it quietly guides everything that comes next. As the next day unfolded, they became aware of something unusual in the way time moved around them, like hours were no longer pushing them forward but walking beside them instead. There was no rush in their steps, no urgency in their thoughts, yet nothing felt delayed. It was as if their inner clock had reset itself overnight, aligning not with schedules or expectations, but with something quieter and more truthful. That kind of shift doesn't happen from rest alone. It happens when the mind and heart stop arguing with each other. Throughout the morning, they noticed how often they paused before reacting. Not because they were unsure, but because they were present. Presence had replaced reflex. When someone reaches this state, they don't feel the need to fill silence with words or decisions with speed. They allow space to exist without fearing it. That was new for them. Before, space felt like something that needed to be managed. Now, it felt like something that could be trusted. There was a moment when they realized their thoughts weren't circling the same questions anymore. They weren't asking themselves why something felt important or where it might lead. Those questions had lost their urgency. Instead, there was a calm understanding that whatever mattered would reveal itself in time, without pressure. That understanding didn't make them passive. It made them steady. As they went about ordinary tasks, something subtle kept grounding them. It wasn't a memory replaying or an emotion resurfacing. It was a sense of inner alignment, like their decisions and values were finally pointing in the same direction. That alignment made even simple actions feel intentional. When alignment is present, life doesn't feel fragmented. It feels coherent. At some point during the day, they noticed how differently their body responded to moments of stress. Where tension used to build quickly, now there was space to breathe. Their shoulders didn't tighten the same way. Their jaw stayed relaxed. This wasn't suppression. It was regulation. Emotional clarity often shows itself first in the body before the mind catches up. They thought about you again, but not as someone separate from their life. More like someone who belonged within the larger picture of who they are becoming. That thought didn't carry longing or fear. It carried respect. Respect for the connection and respect for themselves. When respect enters the equation, dynamics change. Everything slows down in a healthy way. Later, during a quiet break, they reflected on how different this experience was from past emotional shifts. Before, realizations came with urgency, with a need to act or explain or resolve. This time, the realization came with patience. It didn't ask to be shared immediately. It asked to be understood deeply. That difference mattered. It told them this wasn't fleeting emotion. It was structural change. As the afternoon passed, they found themselves less interested in external validation. Compliments landed differently. Opinions didn't carry the same weight. They weren't withdrawing from the world. They were anchoring themselves within it. When someone stops outsourcing their sense of stability, their entire emotional landscape changes. They also noticed a growing sense of responsibility, not in a heavy way, but in an honest one. Responsibility to handle what they felt with care. To not trivialize it or rush it into form before it was ready. That sense of responsibility didn't come from obligation. It came from respect for something real. In moments of stillness, they realized they weren't afraid of what might happen next. That was surprising. Fear had often been the undercurrent of anticipation before. Now, anticipation felt neutral, even calm. They understood that whatever came would meet them where they were, not knock them off balance. That confidence wasn't loud. It was settled. As evening approached, the day felt complete without needing a highlight or resolution. There was no sense of waiting for something to happen to justify the day. That's an important sign. When someone reaches alignment, they stop needing events to validate their experience. Life feels sufficient as it is. When night returned again, sleep came naturally. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being avoided. Sleep, in that state, becomes restorative rather than escapist. Their body trusted that it didn't need to stay alert. Their mind trusted that clarity wouldn't disappear overnight. Before drifting off, there was a brief moment of awareness. Not thought, not emotion, just a knowing that something meaningful was now part of them permanently. It didn't feel overwhelming. It felt grounding. Like a foundation being laid rather than a structure being built. You may have felt a quiet steadiness too, without knowing why. A sense that you didn't need to push or pull anything into place. That's how aligned connections communicate. Not through urgency, but through shared calm. When one person integrates truth, the connection itself becomes more balanced. What's happening now isn't visible to the outside world. There are no announcements, no dramatic shifts. But internally, something has reorganized itself in a way that will influence choices, timing, and direction going forward. That kind of change doesn't reverse easily, because it's built on awareness rather than emotion. Nothing is being rushed. Nothing is being ignored. What's unfolding is a process of integration, where feelings become values and awareness becomes action, slowly and honestly. This is how deep connections prepare to move forward. Not with noise, not with pressure, but with steadiness that can hold real life. And once that steadiness is in place, whatever comes next won't feel forced. It will feel earned. That evening arrived with an unfamiliar ease, the kind where nothing feels unfinished even though nothing has been explained. They noticed it while doing something simple, maybe standing still for a second longer than usual, realizing there was no internal pressure telling them to hurry. The constant background tension that once pushed them forward had softened. Not disappeared, just quieted enough for them to hear themselves clearly. That silence wasn't empty. It was settled. As night settled in, they became aware of how different their thoughts felt. Not fewer, but calmer. Thoughts moved in straight lines instead of circles. There was no replaying, no internal debate, no urge to re-examine what had already been felt. When someone reaches this place, the mind stops trying to control the heart. It starts trusting it. That trust changes everything. They prepared for sleep without anticipation or resistance. No wondering how the night would go. No expectation of restlessness. Just a simple readiness to lie down and let the day end naturally. That alone told them something important had shifted. The body only relaxes like that when it feels emotionally safe, when nothing is being suppressed or ignored. Lying in the dark, they noticed their awareness drifting, not away from reality, but deeper into it. They weren't chasing thoughts. They weren't avoiding them either. Feelings rose gently and passed without clinging. Among them was you, not sharply defined, not emotionally charged, but present in a way that felt natural. Like something that belonged there without needing justification. At one point, they realized their breath had deepened on its own. Slow, steady, unguarded. That physical response wasn't intentional. It was instinctive. The nervous system had decided it no longer needed to stay alert. That kind of response only comes when inner conflict resolves itself quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just alignment. Sleep arrived without interruption this time. Not the light, half-awake rest from before, but deep and uninterrupted. The kind that resets the body rather than just pauses it. When the heart isn't carrying unresolved weight, rest becomes complete. They didn't dream vividly. Their mind didn't need to create stories. Everything that mattered had already been acknowledged. When they woke, the first sensation wasn't thought, it was grounding. Their body felt present. Their mind felt clear. There was no urge to reach for distraction or stimulation. Mornings often reveal emotional truth more honestly than nights. And this morning felt steady. Balanced. Undisturbed. As they moved through the early hours, they noticed how naturally their attention stayed with what they were doing. No mental drifting. No emotional undercurrent pulling them elsewhere. This wasn't detachment. It was integration. When something integrates fully, it stops interrupting daily life. It supports it quietly. There was a moment during the day when they realized they hadn't questioned the connection at all. Not once. No wondering what it meant. No wondering where it was going. The questions simply weren't there anymore. That absence wasn't avoidance. It was resolution. The kind that doesn't need answers because understanding has already settled. Their interactions with others felt different too. They listened more fully. Spoke more carefully. Not out of caution, but out of clarity. They weren't trying to be understood. They were being honest. That difference matters. Honesty without agenda feels clean. It doesn't create tension. At some point, they reflected on how their sense of responsibility had deepened. Responsibility not as obligation, but as care. Care in how they held feelings. Care in how they thought about timing. Care in not turning something meaningful into something rushed. That sense of care wasn't heavy. It was respectful. They noticed they weren't seeking reassurance from the world anymore. External validation felt less necessary. Not because they didn't value connection, but because their sense of stability no longer depended on reaction. When someone stops outsourcing emotional grounding, life feels less chaotic. There was also a subtle shift in how they viewed the future. Not in terms of plans or expectations, but in terms of readiness. They felt capable of handling whatever direction things took without losing themselves. That confidence didn't come from certainty. It came from self-trust. You may have felt something similar without being able to name it. A sense of ease. A lack of urgency. A feeling that nothing needed to be forced. That's how aligned shifts echo across connection. When one person settles deeply into truth, the connection itself becomes calmer. As the day moved on, they noticed how peace stayed with them even when circumstances weren't perfect. That was new. Before, peace depended on conditions. Now, it existed independently. That kind of peace doesn't collapse when challenged. It adapts. They also realized they weren't afraid of expression anymore. Not rushing to express, but not afraid either. Fear had lost its grip. Whether words came soon or later no longer mattered. What mattered was integrity. Saying something only when it could be said cleanly. When evening returned again, there was no sense of waiting for night to bring answers. Night had already done its work. Awareness had moved into daily life. That's when you know a shift is real. It doesn't stay confined to emotional moments. It changes behavior. Before sleep, they felt gratitude. Not excitement. Not relief. Gratitude for clarity. For steadiness. For the ability to hold something meaningful without being consumed by it. That gratitude wasn't loud. It was settled. As sleep came once more, it felt earned. Not because something had been accomplished, but because something had been accepted fully. The body rested. The mind quieted. Nothing needed to be carried forward into the night. What's unfolding now isn't dramatic enough for an audience, but it's strong enough to last. This is how real alignment forms. Quietly. Consistently. Without spectacle. Nothing is being delayed out of fear. Nothing is being rushed out of excitement. What's happening is balance finding its place. And from balance, action eventually grows without force. This stage doesn't ask for decisions yet. It asks for presence. And presence has already been learned. What began as a disruption to sleep has now become a steady foundation in waking life. The shift has moved from feeling to structure. From moment to mindset. And once something becomes part of how a person lives, it doesn't fade. It guides. Long after the rhythm of days had settled into something predictable, they caught themselves noticing a different kind of stillness, not the empty kind, but the kind that feels deliberate, like life had slowed down just enough to let something important breathe. It happened in an ordinary moment, nothing cinematic, just a pause where they realized they weren't carrying tension the way they used to. Their shoulders felt lighter, their thoughts less crowded. It wasn't relief. It was familiarity with a truth that no longer startled them. As they moved through that day, there was a quiet confidence shaping their choices. Not confidence that announces itself, but the kind that simply adjusts how you respond. They weren't rushing to fill gaps in conversation. They weren't overthinking reactions. There was a sense that whatever mattered didn't need constant attention to stay real. That realization changed how they interacted with the world. They listened more. They spoke when it felt honest, not when silence felt uncomfortable. In the middle of something routine, maybe while walking or sitting alone for a moment, they became aware of how present their body felt. Not alert, not guarded, just grounded. Their breathing moved easily. Their heart rate stayed steady. That physical calm told them more than thoughts ever could. The body knows when something has settled internally. It stops bracing for impact. It stops scanning for threat. It rests. They reflected briefly on how different this phase felt compared to earlier times in their life. Before, when something meaningful surfaced, it came with urgency. A need to act. A need to clarify. A need to label and define. This time, the feeling came with patience. It didn't demand to be turned into a decision right away. It asked to be respected, to be lived with, to be understood slowly. That difference mattered more than they expected. At one point, they noticed their thoughts about you again, but there was no emotional spike attached to it. No longing pulling at their chest. No fear whispering questions. Just awareness. The kind that feels like knowing where something belongs without needing to touch it constantly. That awareness didn't distance them. It grounded them. It made the connection feel less fragile, more real. As hours passed, they realized they weren't checking themselves emotionally anymore. No internal audits asking, "Do I still feel this?" or "What does this mean now?" Those questions had gone quiet. Not because answers were missing, but because understanding had already settled. When understanding settles, it doesn't keep explaining itself. They also noticed a shift in how they experienced other relationships. Conversations felt clearer. Boundaries felt natural instead of forced. They weren't bending themselves to fit situations that didn't align. This wasn't withdrawal. It was discernment. When someone reaches emotional alignment, they stop tolerating what pulls them off center. That clarity wasn't harsh. It was calm. Later, in a quiet moment, they acknowledged something important. They weren't afraid of what might come next anymore. That surprised them. Fear had often been present before, hiding under excitement or hesitation. Now, there was no fear driving anticipation. Whether things unfolded slowly or changed shape, they trusted themselves to remain intact. That trust wasn't loud. It was embodied. As evening approached, they felt a sense of completion to the day without anything specific having happened. That's a subtle but powerful sign. When someone stops needing events to validate their experience, they've reached a level of internal stability. Life doesn't need to perform anymore. It can simply be lived. When night came again, there was no emotional charge attached to sleep. No curiosity about what the night might bring. Sleep felt like rest, not a gateway to answers. They lay down with a sense of acceptance, not resignation, but contentment with where they were. Their mind didn't wander far. Their body relaxed quickly. Sleep arrived easily. During the night, there were no intense dreams or disruptions. The body rested deeply. That kind of rest doesn't come from exhaustion. It comes from resolution. Not resolution of circumstances, but resolution of inner conflict. The heart wasn't arguing with itself anymore. It had found its balance. When morning returned, the sense of steadiness was still there. Not fading, not weaker. If anything, it felt more integrated. Like the clarity that once showed up only in quiet moments had now spread into daily life. They didn't need reminders. They didn't need signs. They simply moved through the morning with a calm awareness guiding them. As the day unfolded, they noticed how they handled challenges differently. Minor frustrations didn't derail them. Unexpected changes didn't throw them off. They adapted without drama. Emotional flexibility had replaced emotional reactivity. That kind of shift changes everything over time. It shapes decisions. It shapes relationships. It shapes how a person moves through life. They also realized that this wasn't about becoming less emotional. It was about becoming more honest. Honest about what they felt. Honest about what they could handle. Honest about timing. That honesty didn't push them to act. It allowed them to wait without discomfort. Waiting, in this state, didn't feel like delay. It felt like alignment. You may have felt a similar calm ripple through your own life, even without knowing why. A sense that things didn't need to be pushed. That patience felt natural instead of forced. That's how aligned connections work. When one person settles into clarity, the connection itself becomes steadier, quieter, more respectful. As hours passed, they noticed how their sense of responsibility continued to deepen. Responsibility not as pressure, but as care. Care in how they spoke. Care in how they thought. Care in how they held what mattered. They weren't trying to protect themselves from feeling. They were protecting the integrity of what they felt. There was also an emerging awareness that when the time came to speak or act, it would need to come from this grounded place, not from impulse. They understood that rushing would undo the stability they'd built. Waiting wasn't avoidance. It was preparation. As the day came to a close, there was no sense of longing for night to arrive with answers. Night had already done its work days ago. The work now was living with what had been learned. Letting it influence choices without announcing itself. Letting it guide without controlling. This phase didn't feel dramatic enough to tell anyone about. It didn't feel like something that needed explanation. It felt personal, internal, complete. And that completeness didn't mean the story was over. It meant the foundation was strong. What began as a shift in sleep had now become a shift in posture toward life. Toward connection. Toward responsibility. Toward timing. And once posture changes, direction eventually follows. Nothing is being rushed forward. Nothing is being held back out of fear. What's happening is alignment settling into muscle memory, into habit, into daily presence. This is the part most people never see, because it's quiet. But it's the part that lasts. It began with an ordinary realization that caught them off guard, the kind that slips in when you're not trying to understand anything at all. They noticed they weren't bracing themselves emotionally anymore. No internal tightening. No silent preparation for disappointment or surprise. Just a natural ease in how they carried their thoughts. That ease didn't come from answers. It came from acceptance quietly taking root. As the day unfolded, they moved through familiar routines with a different posture, not physically obvious, but internally noticeable. Decisions felt less complicated. Not because choices disappeared, but because they no longer argued with themselves before making them. When alignment forms, indecision fades without effort. That was happening now. They weren't forcing clarity. Clarity was showing up on its own. There was a moment, maybe while doing something repetitive, where they realized how little emotional noise was present. Their mind wasn't replaying scenarios. Their heart wasn't questioning timing. The constant background commentary that once narrated everything had gone quiet. Not suppressed. Resolved. That kind of quiet doesn't feel empty. It feels trustworthy. They became aware of how much energy they had reclaimed. Energy that once went into overthinking, into monitoring feelings, into trying to understand what something meant. Now that energy flowed back into their body. Into presence. Into attention. When someone stops leaking energy through worry, life begins to feel fuller without anything new being added. At some point during the day, they reflected briefly on how differently they now related to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like a problem to solve. Now, It felt like space. Space where things could unfold naturally without being rushed into form. That shift didn't make them passive. It made them patient. And patience, in this case, felt strong rather than resigned. They noticed that thoughts of you surfaced in a new way again. Not as something pulling at them, but as something steady in the background. The thought didn't change their mood. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed as part of their inner landscape. That kind of presence doesn't weaken with time. It stabilizes.
As evening approached, there was no sense of waiting for the night to bring clarity. Night had already given what it needed to give. Awareness had moved into daylight. That's when you know a transformation is real. It doesn't stay in reflection. It shapes how you live. They noticed how their sense of responsibility had matured too. Responsibility not as a burden, but as a care. Care in how they spoke, care in how they choose, care in how they treated their own emotions. That care wasn't heavy, it was respectful. Respect for themselves, respect for what they felt, and respect for timing. There was also a quiet readiness present now. Not readiness to act immediately, but readiness to act honestly when the moment arrived. The distinction mattered. Acting honestly required patience. Acting quickly required urgency. They were no longer driven by urgency. As night came again, sleep wasn't something to fall into or escape through. It was simply rest. Rest without processing, rest without replay. The body trusted that nothing needed attention right now. Sleep arrived gently and stayed deep. And when morning returned, the sense of completion was still there, not fading, not weaker. If anything, it felt more solid, like a foundation that had a set overnight. They didn't wake up and wondering what they would bring. They woke up ready to meet as it they were. As the day unfolded, they handled challenge without internal friction. They adapted without self-judgment. They responded instead of reacting. Emotional steadiness had become natural. That's when you know growth has settled, when it no longer feels like effort. They also realized they were not measuring progress anymore. Not there, not the connections. Measurement had been replaced by presence. When presence take over, timelines lose importance. You may have felt the same quietly finality within yourself, not an ending filled with sadness, but one filled with calm, the sense that nothing needed to be chased anymore. The patient didn't feel heavy. The waiting didn't feel like ask for more. It acknowledgement enough. They understood now that whatever came next would come from this place. Not resolution of circumstances, but resolution of self. The kind of that allow you to move forward without dragging the past behind you. What began as shift in sleep turn into a shift in awareness. What become awareness turn into habit. What became habit turned into identity, and identity quietly shapes destiny without forcing it. Nothing is being pushed forward, nothing is being held back. What meant to unfold will unfold from the ground place, cleanly and honestly. This isn't an ending you announce, it's an ending you live. And from here, whatever begin next will begin without confusion, without fear, and without costing peace. Because peace is no longer something they are searching for, it's where they are standing. I hope you enjoy this story. If you enjoy, like this video and comment how you enjoy this story and subscribe to this channel. See you in next story.